Hey, this is Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite new editions of games and remakes of older games. There is a very fine line to draw in this video, and I completely understand if you disagree with some of the directions I'm going to take here. And I'll start off with an example of that before I jump in. And I will also say that I'm going to do a top 10 list, and then I'm probably going to do a pretty extensive design and publisher perspective discussion at the end about a bunch of games that I didn't talk about and my opinions about new editions and remakes in general. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I hope you have the time to listen to the top 10 and that discussion. But the distinction I want to make up front is that I did not include games where you take the game and then make a dual version of it, because that to me is not a new edition or a remake of the game. It's a completely new game that's designed for two players. I didn't include legacy games like Clank. There's Clank and then there's Clank Legacy. Clank Legacy is a remake of Clank, but to me it's a game designed for a completely different purpose, so I didn't include it for this list. And then I didn't include games that are sequels but completely different, kind of like the Above and Below, Near and Far series from Ryan Lockett. Wonderful series, I love it, but they are completely different games even though they're in the same series. The last and the toughest distinction I had to make was games that take a core mechanism but implement other mechanisms in a completely different way. This was a very hard line to draw, but it meant that I didn't include Sushi Roll and Azul Summer Pavilion, two games I absolutely love. I didn't include them on this list. Arguably, they could be on here because they are in some ways remakes of the original game, but they just felt distinctly different than Sushi Roll or Sushi Go and the previous versions of Azul. With that being said, let me jump into this list. I forgot to... Oh, no, here we go. So number 10 on the list is Celestia. Celestia is a remake of an older game. I don't know the name of that older game. Something about clouds. But Celestia is a competitive push-your-luck game where you're trying to get further and further along a row of islands. And as you do so, you are rolling dice, and other players are kind of guessing whether or not you have the cards in hand to meet the requirements on those dice. So there's this fun aspect where you're kind of working together to get further, but also when you just jump out of the boat, you are then rooting against the player who is rolling dice because you don't want them to go any further and get better and better treasures along the way. I have not played the earlier version of Celestia, so I'm not necessarily comparing this to the original version, but I do just really like Celestia. So that's what this top 10 list is not based on me comparing the current edition to the past edition. Some of these I have played the previous edition, others I have not. In this case, I have not played the previous version of this game, but I do really enjoy it, and so I put it at number 10 on this list. That's Celestia. At number 9 on the list, we have Marco Polo II, which I've only played digitally. I've only played it on Board Game Arena. And this was part of the inspiration for this list. And this is kind of where I mentioned that fine line between a game that takes a core mechanism and re-implements it, and a game that is completely different. But Marco Polo II, I consider in many ways to be a remake of the original Marco Polo, which still exists. It's still a wonderful Euro game, but I think the designers maybe learned a little bit from the original Marco Polo and all the fan feedback, and they said, okay, let's do it again, but let's not completely negate the original game. Let's do a lot of new stuff with this, and they did. So Marco Polo 2 is essentially the core game of Marco Polo. You have very asymmetric characters. You are placing dice on the board to activate actions, and the map on Marco Polo 2 is a big part of the game. You're kind of moving around the map, establishing essentially a presence in a bunch of different cities that unlock new actions and new ongoing benefits. And there are some distinct differences between the original games. There's a set collection element of the game related to where you're moving around on the board. Also, the contracts come out in a very different way, and there are a few new resources. But it's just, I think they took what they learned from the first Marco Polo and made... I'm hesitant to say a better version because I do still really enjoy the original Marco Polo, but I do also really enjoy the sequel Marco Polo 2 as well. So that's why it's number 9 on this list. Number 8 on this list is QE. This is one of two companies made by Board Game Tables that kind of specializes in taking older games and updating them and making them new. And QE is a wonderful implementation of that. I think QE is actually based on a previous game called QE. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. This is an auction game where you can bid any amount that you want. You have these whiteboard, you can kind of see it on the back of the box here. You have these whiteboard tiles that you are bidding on. And so we might have a certain thing that's up for grabs that we're all trying to bid on, and you might bid $10, and I might bid $1,000,000. And the reason that I wouldn't always bid $1,000,000 is because at the end of the game, the player who has spent the most money, who has bid the most in total, or has at least the highest winning bids, will lose the game. They have no chance of winning. They're not allowed to win the game. And so it's really a game that's in control of the players, because if I do bid with $1,000,000, suddenly oh, Jamie has spent a ton of money there. I can bid $100,000 on my next bid because I am not at risk for losing the game for having spent the most money. And it kind of escalates from there. It's kind of a silly fun game, but it's a great silly fun game, and I really enjoy it as an auction game. That's QE. My next game that is a new addition or a remake of a previous game, number 7 on this list, is New York Slice. I don't own this game. This is a game that was originally, I think, based on dividing up either a cake or a pie, and Bezier Games updated it to pizza. And they really did a great job with the theme. It really looks like you have a pizza on the table. The rulebook is a menu. And just through and through, it looks like it looks like it's in a pizza box. It is an I cut you choose game, one of my favorite mechanisms, where one player is dividing up a bunch of pieces of a pizza and into a number of increments equal to the number of players. So if there are 5 players, I'm dividing the pieces of pizza into 5 different segments. And then each other player gets to choose those pieces, and those pieces can either score right away, or they can essentially be flipped over to score later in the game. But you're essentially deciding, okay, this piece is just going to score for pepperoni, or you can collect those pieces to try to have a majority of specific types of toppings that you look for at the end of the game. But I love the I cut you choose element. It flows really well. It's really easy to teach. It's a great game for conventions. And while I haven't played the previous version of it, I think they did a great job remaking it with the pizza theme. So that is number 7, New York Slice. My number 6 favorite new addition or remake is Camel Up. Camel Up. Yeah, Camel Up is a game that isn't actually all that old. I think the original came out maybe 5 years ago. It is a racing game where each player is betting on different camels to finish the race and manipulating those camels a little bit throughout the game. The original version was great. I think it did a very solid job at what it accomplished. And the new edition is better. I mean, they did some things that just made it better. And this is, I think, a great example of a game where when they decided to make a new edition, they could have just used a lot of the art from the original. They could have used a lot of the same components, but instead they redid all the art. They added some new mechanisms that encourage temporary partnerships between players, and they really upgraded some of the components as well. There's a pyramid that has all the dice inside of it, and you kind of shake this thing up and then pop one out. The pyramid, they made a much better version of this component for the new edition. They also added pop-up palm trees on the board. So when you open the game board, these palm trees pop up in 3D out of the board. They didn't have to do that, but they did. They made the board even more beautiful than it was before. As well as the additions of those mechanisms. This is one that I have played both versions of Camel Up, and I think they did a fantastic job with the new edition. And it's just a lot of fun to bet on these camels and have some camels moving one way. You have these other camels that are moving the other way and picking up the camels. That's one of the core mechanisms of this game, that camels end up stacking on one another. And if you move any of the camels that are below on the bottom, they are moving the camels that are sitting on top of them. So it's kind of silly fun, and it's a great game, a great new addition. That's the new edition of Camel Up. My number 5 favorite new addition or remake is The King is Dead. This is one of the most recent ones, The King is Dead 2nd Edition. This is actually a game that I believe the original game was The King is Dead, and then it was The King of Siam, and then The King is Dead 2nd Edition. I might be reversing those first 2 editions. But I've only played the most recent edition of it, and I just had a blast with it. The core hook of this game is that you have, I believe, 10 cards, and all players have the same 10 cards, and you can only play each card once. And so throughout the game, you are deciding when to play cards and when to pass as you try to kind of wrest control over certain areas of the board, but really you're betting on these these third-party entities that have control of the board. And so on your turn, you're either playing a card or you are passing. And if you're passing, you are opting out of that round, but you're holding on to cards for future rounds because you can play more than one card per round. In fact, in the first round, you can play all 10 cards if you want, and then you'd have nothing to do at pass for the rest of the game. You wouldn't want to do that. But I love that you start off with a wealth of options at the beginning of the game, and they're not complex options. If they were really complicated, I think that would be overwhelming, but they're not all that complicated at all. And you're just deciding when is the right time to play these cards. I really enjoyed my play of King's Dead 2nd Edition, and I can't wait to play again. I can't compare it to the previous editions, but I love the game, and so I put it at my number 5 slot on this list. That's the King's Dead 2nd Edition. My number 4 game on this list is one of my favorites. You can see this in a lot of my favorite lists, and that is Downforce. This is by the other company I wanted to mention, Restoration Games, where their whole point of existing is to take older games and update them, modernize them, make them better and more beautiful. And I think they, in addition to the Camel Up example, do a fantastic job of taking games where they don't necessarily need to update a lot, but they do. I think Downforce is actually one of the games that has changed the least from the previous version, but they redid all the art. They streamlined the mechanisms. They've added expansions that offer new courses, and they updated the components as well. They just made it a modern, flashy, beautiful, and easy to play game about racing. In Downforce, you are playing on your turn. You are moving cars around a track. You have one car that is associated with you that you are hoping will reach the end of the track first, or at first or second or third. But along the way, you're also betting on any car. So you could end up betting on your car. You could bet on other cars. And on your turn in the game, you are playing a single card from hand that moves all of the cars indicated on that card itself. And so there's a lot of positive player interaction in this game, in that you are playing a card and moving not just your car, but probably some other cars as well, as noted on that card. And at times you're playing those cards strategically so that you benefit more than other players, or at least the cars that you've bet on are benefiting more than the cars that you haven't bet on. I think it's a brilliant game. It's super easy to teach. I've played it dozens and dozens of times. I absolutely love Downforce. And I think, while I can't compare it to the original, I know that this version is so solid and so good that I really do think it's a wonderful remake or new edition of the original Downforce. That's why it's my number 4 on this list. Normally I would put these games on this chair right here, but I have a cat on this chair, so I can't put them there right now. The number 3 game on this list is one of the other really new additions to this list as well, and that is Mysterium Park. So Mysterium Park is the game Mysterium, the renowned game Mysterium, cooperative game where one player is a ghost that can't communicate except through these beautifully illustrated dream cards, and the other players are investigators interpreting those cards to determine like who, what, where the murder happened, who was how the murder was murdered, and who the murderer was. I've said that in the most awkward way possible, but it's a cooperative game where players are doing that. Mysterium Park is the same game, except with no murder weapon and a much, much easier way to set up the game. In the original Mysterium, setup was kind of a beast. I mean, you had to really sift through a bunch of cards to figure out, to kind of determine what the murder weapon was, but in secret, and determine what who the murderer was and where the murder happened. That was really clunky. It did involve a really awesome big 3D screen that you put up in between the ghost and the other players, but the setup was kind of a killer for that game. Not a killer. I still love Mysterium. But Mysterium Park impressed me with how much it streamlined Mysterium down to just 2 rounds, where you were determining the location and the murderer, and then a final round where you really confirm it. But it's very brief. And the setup in particular is really cool. You can kind of see it here, where the ghost uses a random card and then a 3x3 grid to determine what they're trying to get the investigators to select. And so the entire setup for the game is put these 9 cards down here, flip up one of these cards so the ghost can see it, and begin. And that's it. It's super, super streamlined and simple. And it really, I think it. I don't exactly know how the designers did it, because Mysterium was such a great game and is such a great game, but I love that they revisited it for this edition. And if you like Mysterium, I would highly, highly recommend this, because this, I found, gets to the table all the time. Mysterium did not, because of that setup, even though it's not a super long game. But this just makes it so much more streamlined. I love this edition. I'm raving about it now. This is Mysterium Park, my number 3 remake on this list. My number 2 remake or new addition on this list is a beast, and that is... Did I pick up something else? Yeah, I picked up something else. It is Glen More II Chronicles. I have played the original Glen More, and I love the mechanism because I love one-way action selection tracks. That's the core mechanism in this game. You're kind of moving as far as you want along this track and picking up the tile that you land on. I love that, but it did not impress me visually. It didn't have a great layout, didn't have a great board. There were a lot of things that were lacking, I think, in that original edition. Glen More II took everything they learned, but kept all the core mechanisms that were awesome in this game. They revised some tiles, and they just upped the ante a ton by adding a whole new map to the game. They added new cards, and they added... they added one thing that I don't actually think was necessary to the game, but still made it really cool. But they just enhanced everything. They made the tiles bigger and thicker, and... it's just a wonderful game. I really, really enjoy this game. Not just that mechanism, the one-way action track, but also there's this mechanism where you're always comparing yourself to the lowest scoring player. So it's really hard to run away with anything in this game because you're always kind of just comparing yourself to other players. But you also just never want to be the player in last place for any certain scoring category because then you get nothing. I love that mechanism in the game. The thing that they added that I don't even know was really needed was the Chronicle system, which is a series of different scenarios, essentially, tweaks to the rules that make the game feel a little different every time, but they do require new rules every time you play. We've played with many of them. Some are very good, some we didn't enjoy quite as much. But the core game is just so good. The core revised game of Glen More II, even without any of the Chronicles, is awesome. Hopefully someday they'll make this without the Chronicles in it, because I don't think the Chronicles are necessary for retail. I don't know if they're planning on doing that, but because that'll make it even more accessible to a lot of people. But if you do have the chance to get this on Kickstarter or wherever they're selling it, I highly recommend Glen More Chronicles 2. It's a wonderful, wonderful game. There's also tile placement in the game. I didn't even mention that. Tile placement, great mechanism as well. My favorite series, one of my favorite series, is Time Stories. I love the original Time Stories series. It had an 8-episode arc, and then it ended. And I even did a video recently where I talk about my 11 favorite scenarios in Time Stories. It's one of the few games that I can say I've played that many different scenarios or expansions for. But after they finished that arc, they didn't just start over from the beginning. They didn't just say, okay, we're going to take this core game idea again and just add more scenarios to it. Instead, they revisited the game and came up with Time Stories Revolution. Time Stories Revolution is a standalone series. So if you want to play an episode of Time Stories Revolution, you just buy a single box and you have everything in this box that you need to play. So they got rid of the board. They got rid of the dice. They changed the time system so that it's not a time loop game anymore. It's still time travel, but instead, in the original Time Stories, if you ran out of time, so basically you jump back into time, you're doing some stuff, and typically in a different version of our world, a fantasy version, a science fiction version of our world. If you run out of time, you have to jump back to the future and then start over again, which could be good in some ways. I do love time loop fiction, but it could also be a little annoying. In Time Stories Revolution, they get rid of that idea. You're still spending time. Time still is an important resource, but you are never looping back around. It's a completely different use of time as a resource, where time becomes really, really important for you to use. You don't want to run out of it. You have to kind of reset some elements of your character when you do, but you get to keep on going. You get to keep on playing the scenario, and you don't have to start over. I love that about Time Stories Revolution. It also adds a brilliant tweak on skill tests, the skill test mechanism, where you are either you're generally trying to get an exact number. So you might enter a fight, and you need to get deal 3 damage to win the fight. But there's things that that can happen after the skill. When you do this, there's some cards that you flip over a card that influences the number a little bit. But the key here that I'm trying to get to is that if you get exactly that number 3, that's great. If you go over, that can be good. Sometimes it can be bad. And if you go under, sometimes that can be good. Sometimes that can be bad. But you always get a result. There's always a result to the skill test, and you get to continue to move forward because there are things that happen in those 3 different situations: exactly, less than, or greater than. I think that's a really, really clever way of doing a skill test mechanism. I love what they did. I love that they revisited the series in a completely different way while still making it feel while still the core of the game feeling very much like Time Stories, and the core elements are still there. But Time Stories Revolution is my number one favorite new edition or remake of a game. We actually still have a lot to talk about here. So I've now finished the top 10 list. I'm going to move on to discussing a few games that I didn't mention and my general thoughts about new editions and sequels. So the biggest thing, I kind of talked about this with Camel Up. My biggest thing is if a publisher decides to revisit a game for a new edition or a remake, I think they should go all out. I'm always surprised, or sometimes surprised, when a publisher announces a new edition of the game and it is essentially just the previous version of the game. They have not redone or fixed the things, the art, the mechanisms, the things that that a lot of people may have talked about that game. I have a few games in particular in mind, but I'm not going to mention them here. So that is the big overarching idea. If you're going to spend the resources to go all in and say, hey, we're making a new edition, we're negating the value of the previous edition, go all out. Make it actually feel like a brand new take, a fresh take on the game. And that's another thing that I try to think about when I think about new editions of games. There's a difference between a reprint and a new edition. A reprint of a game is just, you take you take the files for the game and you print them again. Sometimes when that happens, you fix little things. You fix little typos. Maybe you add a little clarification. Maybe you ban something that really just doesn't work, something that's really overpowered or underpowered. A new edition of a game is a game where you have completely changed significant elements of the game, completely changed or added significant elements, whether it's art, graphic design, or mechanisms, or gameplay, or even theme. And again, I think that's an important thing to distinguish between the new edition and the reprint. Let me talk about some specific games here. This will jump all. Actually, let's start with one of our games. There's one of our games that we have done new editions for, and that is Viticulture. I didn't want to do new editions for it, but this is the first game that I designed for publication. This is the first game that we published, and we had to learn some things along the way. So there was the original version of Viticulture that came out, and on Kickstarter there were some elements, in particular the Grande Worker. This was back in 2012. The Grande Worker wasn't part of the core game at the time, but the Grande Worker was so well received as part of that Kickstarter campaign that I realized that it should be in the core game. If you play Viticulture now, you've probably never thought of it without the Grande Worker because it's such a core part of the game. The Grande Worker lets you take any action even if other workers are blocking that action from being used, and can also just act as a regular worker if you want. So that was really core to this game. There are also some other kind of just confusing mechanisms. The way wine was originally made was confusing. There were a few other little things that just needed to be fixed. So I made Viticulture 2nd edition. Again, I was intending that to be the final edition. But then some things happened with a famous designer that I really respect, Uwe Rosenberg, came in and had some recommendations for elements of Tuscany, the Tuscany expansion, and he recommended that we add them to the core Viticulture box. And we did. So now, and that was the original Tuscany. So now there is Viticulture Essential. There is Tuscany Essential, which is completely separate than this. It's an expansion for this, but there's no overlapping components. And there are also some other expansions for Viticulture. I never hope to make new editions like that because I don't think it's the best fan service. I think it's better if you really focus on getting the game right the first time. And if you do make changes, that you make it easy for fans to get those changes, which we did. We sold update packs for Viticulture, so anyone who had the first edition could buy a 2nd edition update pack. When we made the Essential Edition, we had an update pack for anyone who had the 2nd edition, and so on. But it is super annoying. I don't think it's the most respectful thing to do to fans, and that's why I avoid it in general. Let's talk about some games from other companies then. There's Through the Ages. Through the Ages almost made this list because I really do like what they did with the new version of Through the Ages. Highly acclaimed game. One of the major things they did with Through the Ages is that the original game was so popular, was played so often, that they found certain elements of the game that could be better or could be fixed, certain cards that needed fixing. And they did. They gathered all that information for a long time, and they took that information and made a better version of the game, the new version of Through the Ages. I think you could say the same thing about Twilight Imperium. We're currently on the 4th edition of Twilight Imperium. The game has spanned many, many years at this point, and while the 3rd edition was highly acclaimed, there's a whole documentary actually that you can watch on YouTube by Shut Up and Sit Down about how Fantasy Flight decided we're going to make a new edition of this. We're going to make the best possible version given modern standards of Twilight Imperium 4th edition. There's also Mansions of Madness Second Edition and other games like this, including Descent, where the game was designed before apps were a big thing, and then they realized, okay, we can add apps to these games to make setup and gameplay a lot easier, and it does. It makes the game a lot better. So Mansions of Madness, I haven't played the original edition, but I love the way the app is used in the current version of Mansions of Madness, so that setup and gameplay is really easy, and the app can kind of tweak the odds and tweak different things behind the scenes that would be a little fiddly for players to control during the game. That one actually almost made my top 10 list. There's also deluxe versions of games. So there's a game that I love called Yedo. Yedo had a deluxe version on Kickstarter last year. And you've probably seen a lot of this on Kickstarter now. You have the original game that comes out, and instead of releasing just a new edition or a remake of the game, the publisher comes out with a deluxe version of that game where they kind of give it the Glen More treatment. Also essentially give it the Camel Up treatment that I mentioned earlier, where they redo all the art and deluxify some of the components. Yedo Deluxe is one I wanted to mention because I love Yedo so much. There are two specific examples I wanted to mention here because I think they're really interesting, and that is Gaia Project and Clank in Space. These are two games that I think are objectively better designed than the originals. Gaia Project is a sequel to Terra Mystica that uses many of the same mechanisms as Terra Mystica. Clank in Space is a spiritual successor, is a sequel, a remake of Clank. However, I think Clank's more fun. And I also think Terra Mystica is more fun. And I say that not to put down Gaia Project or Clank in Space. I think they're perfectly fine. But I'm saying that because I love Terra Mystica and I love Clank. And it was pretty hard I think it would have been very hard to replace them, even though the designers took what they learned from those games and made newer versions that address some of the issues in the original. But I just think the original is more fun. And part of it might be the theme. I do enjoy fantasy a little bit more than sci-fi in terms of theme. So those, I think, are interesting examples because I think Gaia Project and Clank in Space, they're just objectively better designed, but I don't think they're more fun for me. There's also Dune and Rex. So Dune is a situation where the rights weren't available, and so Fantasy Flight just made essentially the same game, but in a completely different world. There's very recently Raiders of Scythia, or Scythia. So this is Raiders of the North Sea, but with Shem Phillips' brother as the artist. And I think some of the expansions from Raiders of the North Sea that really elevated the game built into the core game itself. That's a very recent example. There's also Resistance and Resistance Avalon. This is kind of a category of games where you have a really good, successful core game, and then you remake it with a different thematic twist, but also a few mechanical twists. We've also seen that in a way with Codenames. There's the original Codenames, and there's Codename Pictures. There's Codenames After Dark. And to segue away from that, there's also IP versions of games. So you have Villainous, which is based on the Disney IP, but then you have Marvel Villainous, which is essentially Villainous, but with the Marvel IP. So it's essentially a remake of the original game, but with a different IP on it. You also have Small World. Small World of Warcraft is the new version of Small World. A few more to mention before I go. Atlantis Rising and Tammany Hall, I think, are two fun stories because with both of them, the publishers that worked on the new versions wanted to publish it because they loved the original game so much. Elf Creek Games, Brent at Elf Creek Games loved Atlantis Rising and wanted to make a modern version of it. And the folks at Pandasaurus Games loved Tammany Hall and wanted to make a modern version of that. I love that. I love when a publisher says, I love this thing so much. I want it to exist. I want it to be reprinted, and I want it to be better than ever. And they take it upon themselves to do that with a game. Another example of that is Brass Birmingham. I know Gavin loves the original Brass, and he wanted to remake the original. So there's Brass Lancashire, and which I'm mispronouncing, I'm sure. And he also wanted to add his own little spin on it, his own little twist. And so Gavin co-designed, I believe, with Martin Wallace, co-designed Brass Birmingham, and it's now one of the top games on Board Game Geek. He did a wonderful job with that. So again, I love that the passion extended from the designer. The last category, one big name to mention is Gloomhaven. There was the original Gloomhaven. It's a fantasy adventure game, tactical combat game, And Isaac came out more recently with Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, which is a more introductory version of the game that uses a storybook format to let you move from one room to the next instead of using a bunch of tiles, which I think is a great, great approach to the game. It kind of addresses that thing with the original Mansions of Madness, where you have a bunch of tiles all over the place. You have to gather them together at different times to form the board. Instead of Gloomhaven, just says, open the book to this page, and you're all set up. I think that's really, really clever. I've also heard great things about the tutorial in Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion, because Isaac wanted to break down the barriers to entry the game. I think that's great. And there's also Frosthaven. Frosthaven is a sequel to Gloomhaven that will use many of the same mechanisms, but will open up the world a little bit and have some town building elements to it. There's many more examples of this. I would love to hear your thoughts about your favorite new editions of games, your favorite remakes of games, and it's fine if you draw the line a little differently than I did. I'm perfectly fine with that. I think that's all the thoughts that I wanted to share today. Thank you for joining me for this longer chat about my top 10 and other games that fit into this mold or don't quite fit into it. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks.